Amen. It really has made me rethink not just the term personal branding, but really the true purpose of idea promotion is the pursuit of truth, right? And knowledge. And in the process of that, you obviously gain a ton yourself. But we talked about earlier, I think they often call it the Fryman technique, where by writing and sharing, you're actually learning more than anyone else. I think it was James Clear that said the person that learns more in any classroom is in fact the teacher. But the importance of being okay with being inconsistent, being continually wrong, your old work contradicting your new work, is very important, but not easy to do because of the cognitive dissonance that admitting you're wrong creates.
This is a central question of Think Again. And I'm so struck. I originally learned this framework from Phil Tetlock, and then I started studying it. I'm so struck by how many people spend too many of their waking hours thinking like preachers, prosecutors, and politicians. So when you go into preacher mode, you're proselytizing your own ideas. In prosecutor mode, you're attacking somebody else's ideas. And in politician mode, you don't even bother to listen to people unless they already agree with your ideas. And I always like to ask, I find that most people have a dominant style that gets them in trouble. So mine is prosecutor mode. If I think you're wrong, I'm like, it is my professional and moral responsibility to correct you, which never goes well. And I've even been called a logic bully, which my wife had to explain to me was not a compliment.
I think I'm a logic bully.
Are you?
Yeah, I think so sometimes.
Fellow prosecutor.
Maybe this is an excuse, so maybe I'm bullshitting myself here. But when I hear an idea, I think part of my pursuit of learning is by challenging it. And that's not always a good thing, especially when it's your girlfriend and she's just trying to tell you something and you're like, no, but logically, and I read this study and I did this podcast. It's like you don't need to interact with people like that all the time.
I make this mistake all the time. And Allison calls me out regularly. She's like, you actually do not need to argue with an idea to understand it. And you don't have to pressure test every single, point that's made. Sometimes you can listen and learn from other people as opposed to duking it out to try to figure out who's right. And I think it's such an important note because in prosecutor mode, you've already concluded that other people are wrong and you're right. So you lose the ability to open your mind. And the same thing happens if you're preaching or politicking. You're basically drinking your own Kool-Aid or listening only to your own tribe and trapping yourself in an echo chamber. And so I got really curious about how do we get out of those modes? What's an alternative? And my favorite alternative is to think more like a scientist. When I say think like a scientist, I do not mean that you need to buy a microscope or, a telescope. I mean that you don't let your ideas become your identity. That you recognize every opinion you hold, it's just a hypothesis. You can test it. Every decision you make, just an experiment. It might succeed, it might fail. And when you do that, it turns out when people can be taught to think more like scientists, when you teach people to see their opinions as hypotheses, their decisions as experiments, lo and behold, they make better choices. They achieve more success because they become more flexible. They change their minds faster. They're quicker to recognize that they're wrong, and that means they're quicker to get it right.
But if Jack had loads of ideas and every single time any idea came out of his mouth, even if it was a good morning, and we all went, Jack, you're so right. It's hard to see how Jack's self-esteem or his ego doesn't take a boost there and him become more committed to being right in the future. Because then imagine if we did that for 1 year as an experiment, then suddenly we turn around one day and go, Jack, what are you talking about? That is wrong. You can imagine his ego, swelling and going, what? So I guess what I'm trying to say is how difficult it is for us to disassociate our self-worth with being right.
Yes. Yeah, a colleague once told me that the worst problem he sees in humanity is the addiction to being right.
Yeah.
And I think it's much more important to focus on getting it right than being right. And one of the ways you do that is you do not let your beliefs become part of your self-concept. So people are like, wait, what do you base it? Who are you if you're not what you think? You are what you value. What's the difference between values and beliefs? Beliefs are what you think is true. Values are what you think is important. And I think this is such a critical distinction because when you start to base your identity, your sense of self, and your ego and your self-esteem and self-worth on what you think is true, then admitting you were wrong is a major threat. Whereas when you start to see yourself as someone who values curiosity or is a lifelong learner, now changing your mind is a moment of growth. So a simple example, before evidence-based medicine, there were a lot of people who called themselves doctors. They'd be like, oh, you're feeling anxious? Let's give you a frontal lobotomy. You think that's an effective way to treat anxiety. That's a belief of yours, right? If that becomes part of your identity, if you see yourself as a professional lobotomist, you are never going to believe the evidence that this is harmful. If you see yourself instead as somebody who helps treat anxiety, and that's your value, the moment you read the careful evidence saying this is not working and it's also really dangerous is the moment you change your mind. And so I think what this means fundamentally is you have a set of principles that you stay true to, but you're very flexible when it comes to your practices and policies.
I'm going to do my very, very best, Adam.
Try it at your own risk.
Yeah, I'm going to try it. Adam, thank you. Thank you for all the work you do, because you've forced me to challenge myself over and over again in all the books you've written. But central to all the books you've written is the idea of challenging oneself, which I think is one of the most important messages, which is just this continual pursuit of truth, knowledge, and questioning the status quo and then questioning that. And I think that process of sort of iterative experimentation, that humility, that ability to maintain the student mindset throughout your career is the path to success in both your professional pursuits, but also your personal ones. It's one of the things that's really helped me in my relationships is this idea of remaining humble to new information and facts. You embody that as a human being, but you embody it in all of your work. And your work is original. And that's why it's so challenging. Something I aspire to in the work that I make is to go to those extra lengths to create wonderfully original work. I sometimes sit on this show and I will recommend someone to go and buy one of the author's books. But in this case, I can't, because I think people need to buy them all. They all offer something so challenging in a very important way. The Hidden Potential is the newest book, right? That's the brand new, that came out in October last year, didn't it? Mm-hmm. But they're all essential books for different chapters and different perspectives and different phases of life. So I'd recommend everybody go buy all three of the books that I have in front of me here, which is the originals, Think Again and Hidden Potential. Get them as a nice little package deal on Amazon, because they are really important books to push your thinking forward. And that's exactly what you've done for me as an entrepreneur. You've pushed my thinking forward. So a huge thank you from myself, but also for the millions of people that have benefited from your work.
Thank you. That's incredibly generous of you. And it means a lot to me considering the source, because you are an original. And one of the things I love about Diary of a CEO is you are constantly challenging people to rethink their ideas and to try new things and unlock their hidden potential. So you're doing what I study on this show, and I think it's amazing. And not anyone can make Malcolm Gladwell cry. I've known him for over a decade. I've never seen him break down into tears before or since. So well done there.
Wow.
Before we wrap, I have a couple questions for you.
Oh, go ahead.
I snuck a couple in as we were going, but there were a couple of things I was curious about, if you're game.
Why do I feel nervous?
I'm turning the tables here. You should feel nervous.
And lastly, you can set up screening questions, which is LinkedIn's way of helping you to find the best possible candidate that matches your needs. And today, I'm giving the Diary of a CEO community a free LinkedIn job post. Head to linkedin.com/DOAC now and let me know how you get on. And terms and conditions apply. That's a free job post, so go get it now.
First question is, where do you think your hidden potential lies?
I think my hidden potential relies in what you would typically think of more creative mediums like music and theater and things like that. I think that's where my hidden potential lies. And I think much of the reason I haven't ever pursued it or unlocked it is because I've lived under this limiting belief that I don't have the right to, because my identity says entrepreneur. And
time to expand your identity.
Yes. And also because I'm not as good at it as people that I think of as like musical or, it's only in recent...
You're not good enough yet.
Exactly. And
okay, so you're not Beyonce today?
Yeah, but I can be Beyonce. But if I committed more time to it and I could get over the initial hurdle of the delta between me and Beyonce, maybe I'd pursue it and maybe I'd become it. But I think that's where my hidden potential lies, is in the creative things. And I think it's in part because when you've succeeded at something, it reinforces your identity as that thing, and that can trap you in a box.
It can. What's something I can do better as a podcast guest?
Oh gosh, great fucking question.
Or writer or thinker or anything.
When I think about great podcast guests on this show, what they do well is they start with stories and then they hit us with some kind of stat, fact, study to reinforce that, and then they kind of follow with a conclusion. And I can tell in the preamble whether the podcast is going to do well, basically based on that, the way that they deliver their information.
I'll say sometimes I fail on that. I think there are a couple of moments where I started with the data because that's where my energy begins.
Yeah.
Where I could have led with story.
Yeah, I think that would maybe be it. I learned from one of our speakers that the more obscure and surprising the start of their response, obviously the more the viewer leans in. So if I said, for example, if you asked me a question and then I responded with, if I look into your left eye, I can make you fall in love with me. Because it's
immediate logic bully. I don't believe that for a second,
yeah.
but I want to hear more.
Exactly. And it's the lean in. And so I was thinking of Dr. Tara Swart, for example, when she came on. She would often start her point with a really obscure, provocative open, and it would make you lean in. Before we started the podcast, I was like, she is going to bang as a podcast. Did the podcast, put it out there, 9 million views on YouTube. She's a smash hit. And then she went on to other people's podcasts, smash it, smash it, smash it, smash it, smash it. And what I identified in the preamble was the way she told stories. You do that well. If there was an opportunity to close the gap from the 9 out of 10 you are to the 10 of excellence, if that exists, it would be just to do that more frequently. Something I'm trying to do. So
thank you. That's enormously helpful and also overly kind. I think part of what you're talking about is what the Heath brothers have called a curiosity gap, where you put out a puzzle and then it becomes, social scientists actually talk about it as an itch that you have to scratch. Like, I got to know more about that. And that's what leads you to kind of lean in on that. I think that's a great note. And that's definitely something I need to work on. I'm always worried when I go on a podcast that the story is too long and I want to have a conversation as opposed to just an interview. And if I were writing it in a book or if I were giving a talk on stage, I would of course tell the story, but like, does the story interfere with the dialogue? And I think I need to let go of that because first of all, there's no reason why you can't tell a short story. Mm-hmm. And second of all, some of the best stories take a couple minutes to unfold.
Oh, 100%. I think all the best things are stories. I think it's the way that the brain finds it most compelling to learn.